Good afternoon, Mouin. How are you?
Hi, Bassam. Great to be with you.
Always good to be with you, Habibi. I am, like yourself and many others, reflecting on some of the events that have actually the potential of creating a tectonic shift in the region. Nonetheless, this series is about what have we learned, and we will proceed as planned with the five items and topics you have chosen. And these are Israel, United States, Palestinians, the West slash Western values and quotation marks, and responsibility for this genocide. Uh, Before we start, I would like to ask you to share with us if you have any comments on the here and now. We start usually with that for a couple of minutes. Where are we now with this? Is with this genocide and its repercussions, and then we'll get into the five topics.
Well, just very briefly, I think what happened on October 7th of last year is that Hamas launched an offensive, the purpose of which was to irrevocably shatter the status quo. And Israel's response over the past year has been a campaign to fundamentally transform the strategic equation in the Middle East. It has done so with absolutely no restraints. That's why we're talking about genocide. That's why we're seeing what we've seen this past week in Lebanon. And it has done so with unconditional support, I would argue, not only from the United States, but from the West in general. I think we really are at a turning point, not only in the region, but arguably in the international system as a whole, because we're seeing the entire international order constructed after the Second World War being shredded before our eyes in order to support and enable Israel's continued hegemony in the Middle East. And this is going to have, I think, very far reaching consequences.
The first topic is Israel. What have we learned in the past year about Israel?
In a sense, we've learned what we always knew. The difference being that now it can no longer be hidden from view, and it's become common knowledge around the globe. Um, Israel is a state that is absolutely determined at any and every cost to maintain its supremacist regime, to maintain its hegemony in the region, and for which no amount of life expended is excessive in maintaining these goals. Um, I think the main thing that we should also have learned in the past year is that Israel as a state is so addicted to war, to violence, to racism, that there can be no durable or sustained peace in the Middle East as long as the Israeli regime continues. We have other examples. Post-war Europe, there would not have been peace in Europe after 1945 if particular regimes in that continent had not been dismantled at the end of the Second World War. Similarly, we could not have had peace in Southeast Asia without dismantling the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime. And most recently, uh, I think it's quite clear that we could not have had peace in Southern Africa if the white minority regimes of, first of all, the Portuguese colonies, but then, and more importantly, of the former Rhodesia and South Africa had not been dismantled and transformed. Of course, I'm making a very clear distinction between the regimes and their citizens, but I think it's now unarguable that unless the Israeli regime is dismantled, and unless this genocidal society that is Israel today is transformed, uh, there certainly can be no durable peace in the Middle East, and I would argue no peace at all. We have seen Israel basically being a raging bull in a china shop, whose operative principle, as put so well by Diana Butu, is that nothing justifies October 7th, yet October 7th justifies anything and everything. It is a society and a state that has gone off the deep end. But we've also learned two additional things. First of all, again, this is something we could and should have known before, is how extraordinarily dependent Israel is on the West and the United States in particular, not only for its very survival, but also in order to prosecute these genocidal campaigns that it has been engaged in the past year. And secondly, that its sponsors and allies will stop at absolutely nothing to ensure that Israel can act as it pleases with total impunity without facing any consequences. And it reminds me of a statement made, ironically enough, by the former Egyptian president Anwar Sadat at the end of the 1973 war, which was that he launched an offensive against Israel to recover his occupied territory. But in the course of doing so, found out that he was facing not Israel, but the full might of the United States.
We will talk later or at another point about the violence, the intrinsic violence that Israel has exhibited for decades, because both you and I am confident, and many of our colleagues and sober analysts do not attribute this to some sort of um essentialist trait or some sort of evil or some sort of, one of those terms that are used in the problematic discourse, mainly in the West, but also it exists in the East, that attributes all sorts of essentialist reasons why people in the region or groups in the region or states in the region or parties in the region are actually violent. And this is the kind of thing that also distinguishes us from these analysts and observers. But unfortunately, we will have to move to the next topic. And this is a big one, geographically and otherwise. And that is, what have we learned in the past year about the United States?
Well, the United States, of course, has since the late 1960s been Israel's primary strategic sponsor. Um, it's it's the enabler of Israeli expansionism. It is the arms supplier of Israel's various wars and so on. But I think what the United States has engaged in during the past year is really on a whole new level, even compared to its immediate predecessor, the Trump administration, and to other former US administrations that were known for being solidly in Israel's camp. Think of Reagan, think of Clinton, think of Bush Jr. The United States has literally stopped at nothing to ensure that Israel can rampage first through the Gaza Strip and then throughout multiple countries in the Middle East with total impunity. At each and every turn, it has stood foursquare behind Israel. It has essentially framed the entire last year as one of Israel engaging in what it terms its legitimate right of self-defense. In other words, genocide is a legitimate act of self-defense. Settler expansionism in the West Bank is a legitimate act of self-defense. What it is now doing in Lebanon is a legitimate act of self-defense. And at the same time, has said that its guarantee of Israel's security is ironclad. I think when we look at what has happened during the past year of the US trying to bully the international community not to hold Israel to account, of the United States willfully shredding not only the international rule book, but even its own domestic legislation, to ensure that Israel can act in the way that it has is really on a different level. And of course, every time a U.S. administration leaves the White House, at least since the 1960s, there's been a tradition that Israel bids that president farewell by saying he's been the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House. I think for whoever follows Biden, whether it is Trump or Harris, that's going to be too high a bar to exceed. It's almost impossible for me to conceive of a president who will be even more pro-Israeli than Biden has been. It's kind of the distinction between, on the one hand, the traditional unconditional U.S. support for Israel, um, with, let's call it, the hysterical devotion to anything and everything that Israel does. And the other interesting thing that we've learned in the United States is, notwithstanding everything I've just said, I think it's also fair to say that the tide is finally turning. If you look at public opinion, if you look at what you've seen on U.S. University campuses during the past year, if you look at the growing cracks within one of the two political parties in the Democratic Party over the past year, if you look, for example, at the Harris campaign's decision to choose Tim Walz rather than Josh Shapiro as a vice presidential candidate, I think there were many reasons for that. But I'm also quite convinced that Shapiro's slavish identification with Israel did play a part. So in that sense, you have kind of this contradiction where U.S. support for Israel has reached unprecedented heights, where one can only say that the U.S. is not only complicit in what Israel's doing, but is an active partner in what Israel's doing on the one hand, while at the same time, Israel's primary strategic asset globally, which has been the solid bipartisan support it enjoys in the US political system, backed by very substantial sectors of public opinion, that is beginning to fray.
Thanks, Maureen. This takes us to another follow up question, which I must ask, even though it's going to have to be brief, if you don't mind. Since you talked about the U.S. and Israel, can you very briefly, and I know this is not fair, but can you tell us a little bit about the U.S.-Israel relationship, not least in terms of who is in charge, if you will, or whose influence on the other is greater? Because although we have argued that the US is always the main player in this relationship, um, it appears to so many, and we've seen this all over the media and actually written analysis in articles, that it's the other way around.
I think it's quite clear that dogs wag tails, and tails do not wag dogs. In this situation, indisputably, it's the United States that is a superpower, and it is Israel that is the proxy. And we have evidence going back at least as far as the 1956 Suez Crisis, that when there's a policy clash between the United States and Israel, when the United States determines that Israeli conduct is fundamentally um, contradicting the U.S. national interest as defined by Washington, it is always Israel that folds. We had this in 1956. We had this, for example, with the 1981 sale of AWACS to Saudi Arabia, which Israel pulled out all the plugs to try to oppose that. We had that in the 1990s when Israel was forced to cancel the sale of Falcon aircraft to China because they contained US technology. There are all kinds of incidents that show very clearly that it is the US that is a superpower, and it is Israel that is a proxy. And I think making the argument that the US is somehow being controlled by an Israel lobby and is constantly being forced to take decisions and pursue policies that it does not want to is really something of a cop out. It allows US elites to shirk responsibility for what they're doing. And not less importantly, I think it allows Arab governments to rationalize their continued paid client relation with the U.S. with the excuse that they're actually trying to counter this influence of the Israel lobby.
Thank you. Let's move to the third topic, which is Palestinians. And although this is uh, you know, it's a grand topic, but if you can, in the next few minutes, tell us what have we learned in the past year about Palestinians.
Well, I think the main thing that we've learned about the Palestinians is that it's now indisputably clear who is the victimizer and who is the victim in this relationship. It was not the Palestinians who went to Poland and Lithuania to establish a state of their own and expel the native population. It was the Zionist movement that came to Palestine with an explicit agenda, not of seeking refuge in Palestine, but of transforming the country into an exclusivist and supremacist Jewish state. So once again, the problem is not the Jewish presence in the Holy Land. It's always been there. The problem is not even high levels of Jewish immigration to Palestine. The problem here is a colonial agenda of transforming an overwhelmingly Arab territory into an exclusivist and supremacist Jewish state, which required the removal of the Arab population, and that is exactly what we saw in 1948. And subsequently, particularly after 1967, the expansion of that state, again with this exclusivist and supremacist agenda, in pursuit of what it calls living space, Lebensraum. And what we've now seen in the past year in the Gaza Strip is that absolutely no resistance of any kind will be tolerated. When you have overwhelmingly peaceful resistance, as you had, for example, in the 1970s in the West Bank, or in the occupied territories during the First Intifada, there is massive and extraordinarily brutal violence and repression visited upon the Palestinians. And when you have active armed resistance to Israel, as you saw, for example, with the PLO in Lebanon in the 1970s, or emanating from the Gaza Strip last year, the response has been a campaign of genocidal violence. And in this latter case, the thorough and systematic destruction of the Gaza Strip to make it uninhabitable, unfit for human habitation. So, Israel and its sponsors have been extraordinarily effective in portraying the Palestinians as the aggressors in this relationship, as terrorists and jihadis and all the rest of it. But I think the past year, for those who were previously unfamiliar or insufficiently familiar with reality, has made indisputably clear that this is not a conflict, if I can just call it a conflict for the sake of argument. It is not one that was initiated by the Palestinians. In other words, we didn't go to their countries to take over their lands and expel them from their homes. They came to ours, and that is the root of everything that we've been experiencing. And the other observation I would make is, despite the extraordinary um, century-long campaign of violence and dispossession visited upon Palestinians by first the Zionist movement, then the State of Israel. Again, um, with the full backing of Israel, something Israel could not have done without its sponsorship by first Great Britain and then France and then the United States. Um, uh, Despite all of that, and despite what Palestinians rightfully see as the betrayal of Arab states, Arab governments, and so on, we've also learned that this is a people that will never surrender, that will never cry uncle, that will not disappear, and that will remain and that will continue to struggle for its inalienable rights until they are recognized and implemented.
Let's move to the fourth topic, and that is the West in quotation marks, and or slash three options, Western values, also in quotation marks. What have we learned about these notions as perceived by those who actually profess to adopt them?
Well, I think we've learned quite a lot about the West during the past year. Again, these are things that would have been apparent to people who had looked closely at these things previously. But the West, particularly since the end of the Cold War, has liked to present itself as constituting the entirety of the international community and, of course, of providing the leadership of that community. What we've learned during the past year is that, in fact, there is a very clear distinction between the international community, meaning the global community of states on the one hand, and the West on the other. And as we've seen, for example, in successive General Assembly resolutions on Palestine during the past year, and attitudes towards international legal institutions like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, is also that there is often a contradiction between the West on the one hand and the international community on the other hand. The West is the custodian of what it calls the rules-based international order. That's an order in which the rules are strictly applied to everyone else, and especially so against enemies and adversaries, but it's also one in which they themselves and their proxies, most prominently Israel in this case, get a pass, are not required to observe any rule whatsoever, and are free to actually undermine the international order. And I think the same observation applies to what are called Western values. Of course, we've had finger wagging Americans and Europeans going throughout the darker parts of the globe for decades now to teach the natives about elementary concepts like human rights, women's rights, democracy, and all the rest of it, because otherwise these poor dark natives wouldn't know the first thing about it. And again, on the altar of Western interests and on the altar of enabling Israeli impunity, these concepts have been thoroughly shredded. In other words, international law, the rule of law, human rights, the rights of children, press freedom, democracy, whatever you want. All these things have been comprehensively shredded when it comes to Israel, because Western values, meaning the power and interests of the West, and with it those of Israel, stand above and beyond any of those values that the West proclaims as its own and as values that it needs to teach to the rest of us. I don't envy these senior officials of US and EU funded NGOs when they now have to go out into the global south and once again with their wagging fingers begin preaching these values and explaining that they are emissaries of the West who are here to teach people how to adopt and respect these, because they will be thoroughly mocked You know, how can you even pretend that you give any consideration whatsoever to human rights when you're enabling and actively complicit in genocide? How can you possibly claim to stand for international law or the rule of law when you're actively working to oppose the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and seeking to prevent them from fulfilling their responsibilities? So these things have been shown to be an absolute sham and a charade, and of course one consequence of this will be that henceforth, autocratic and dictatorial regimes in the global south, particularly those that are closely aligned with the West, will feel that in effect they have an unlimited pass to not only ignore but also repress demands for democracy, for human rights, for the rule of law, and so on, emanating from their own people, because they will know more than ever that Washington, that Brussels, that London, that European capitals have their back.
We arrive at the last um, topic, and it's a big one again. They're all significantly big, and it is the responsibility for this genocide. You can approach it however you feel fit.
Well, of course, the manner that this is being presented um, uh, by Israel first and foremost, by its flunkies and groupies and apologists, and also by many of its supporters in the West, is that it is the Palestinians and the Palestinians exclusively, and specifically Hamas, that is not only responsible, but solely responsible for each and every death that happened not only on October 7th, but after October 7th. So if tens of thousands of Palestinians have been blown to smithereens by the US armed Israeli military, it's not the US's fault, certainly not Israel's fault. It's all the fault of the Palestinians because they started this war. Because after all, history began on October 7th. And anything that happened prior to October 7th, the entire century prior to October 7th, the half plus century between 1967 and October 7th, and certainly the last few years in the Gaza Strip, that's all irrelevant. It doesn't even qualify as relevant history in any way. The only thing that matters is October 7th, for which the Palestinians bear sole and exclusive responsibility, and everything that happened thereafter, for which Palestinians also bear sole and exclusive responsibility. So that's kind of the way this is being presented. Israel has been forced to do this, and of course it's the most moral army in the world, and all the rest of it. But although quite clearly um, Israel is the one perpetrating this genocide, that's why it now has to answer for its actions in The Hague before the International Court of Justice. Although Israel is the one perpetrating it, I think it would be unfair to ascribe responsibility solely to Israel for its genocidal rampage through the Gaza Strip during the past year. Any sentient being understands that Israel would not have been able to do this without the ceaseless supply of weapons and of munition, of diplomatic support that is provided to it, first and foremost by the United States, but also by European countries, by the UK, by Germany, and so on. Israel is not South Africa in this respect. It is dependent upon the West in ways that a colonial regime like South Africa um, never really was. And so, therefore, I think to single out Israel for responsibility for this genocide, because it is the one that has perpetrated this crime of crimes, obscures the very clear responsibility because of complicity of all those countries that have enabled it by supporting it in various ways. And I would also add that, you know, just as we look back at the 1930s and 1940s and look at prominent intellectuals, prominent opinion makers, prominent social figures, and so on, and judge them according to the position they took to not only what they saw happening, but what they knew would be the consequences of what they saw happening. Did they actively support it? Did they allow themselves to be part of it out of either ideological principle or opportunism or whatever, or did they look the other way and hope it would pass them by, or did they take stands of principle and seek to oppose it? I think those very same criteria now need to be applied to all of us. You cannot, you know, drag Radio Rwanda to court and talk about how horrible these Rwandan journalists were in encouraging the mass murders and the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, and not apply the same standards and the same criteria to Israeli media. You cannot look at how, for example, Western news organizations and so on have conducted themselves during this genocide and not judge them with the same criteria and standards that these very same news organizations have used to judge their peers during the 1930s and 1940s. So again, it's very clear who is perpetrating this genocide, but that cannot allow us to obscure who has also been complicit in this, either through active participation or support or even passive acquiescence.
Thanks, Mouin. We are entering our last parting segment, which is where do you think we are headed? What's next? And I say this at a very important historical moment. Um, After the assassination of the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and many commanders before him and with him, which has actually caused a bit of hysteria in the West and Israel, uh, assuming that this is a done deal now, and has been actually quite demoralizing for many. But the future is actually a bit more complicated than either the triumphalism or the defeatism that and you know, things of that nature that we might observe right now. You don't have to focus on this, but I I'm not sure how we can completely avoid it. In all cases, what do you see happening next in the short to medium run?
Well, I will in fact focus on developments in Lebanon during the past week. Israel shamelessly lifting a page, I should add, from the playbook of Nazi Germany in Europe during the 1940s, termed its operation to assassinate the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, Operation New Order. And I think what this signifies is that Israel is not, you know, this was not just an assassination of a movement's leader. This was not just part of a campaign to cease Hezbollah's activities on Israel's northern border in solidarity with the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. In other words, this was not just an effort to delink Lebanon from the Gaza Strip. But this was, as I said at the outset, part of a much broader campaign to fundamentally reconfigure the strategic equation in the Middle East, to dismantle what is known as the axis of resistance or resistance front, element by element. Take out Hamas, take out Hezbollah, with the ultimate goal, I believe, of regime change in Iran. Previous administrations, George W. Bush, um, Obama, even Trump, have not tolerated this from Israel and have prevented it from setting the entire region aflame. In Biden, Israel has found the perfect partner. Uh, I think initially it would have been fair to say that the Biden administration was dragged along unwillingly by Israel's agenda because it refused to place any restraints on Israel and refused to have a public display, in Biden's words, of any daylight between Washington and Tel Aviv. But I think we've now come to a point where the U.S. fundamentally shares the agenda of Israel's most extreme right-wing government in history, and it is an active partner. And so I think the period between today and January 2025, when Biden leaves the White House, is a moment of extraordinary danger. I completely agree with you that this is not a moment for either triumphalism or defeatism. Wars are not decided by assassination. But nevertheless, when we look at the broader implications for the region, for the future, and most certainly for those who live in the region and will remain in the region, it's a moment of not just challenge and opportunity, but also of extraordinary danger.
Thank you very much, Maureen, for your concise and insightful comments and responses and analysis of these topics. There's clearly so much more to share, probably now more than before, because of the actual fog of war, which is now even thicker than it has been as this genocide proceeds. We will see you again. I am confident and appreciate you being with us again.
Thank you very much, Bassam. Thank you very much.
Hello.